Conclave. Chapter 7. The First Ballot. Later, when the experts who were paid to analyse the conclave tried to breach the wall of secrecy and piece together exactly what had happened, their sources were all agreed on this, that the divisions started the moment Mandorf closed the doors. Only two men who were not cardinal electors now remained in the Sistine Chapel. Mandorf was one, the other was the Vatican's oldest resident, Cardinal Vittorio Scavizzi, the 94-year-old Vicar General Emeritus of Rome. Scavizzi had been chosen by the college soon after the Holy Father's funeral to deliver what was described in the Apostolic Constitution as the Second Meditation. This was stipulated to take place in private immediately before the first ballot. Its function was to remind the conclave one last time of their heavy responsibility, to act with the right intention for the good of the universal church. Traditionally it was given by one of the cardinals who had passed the age of 80 and was therefore ineligible to vote, a sop, in other words, to the old guard. Lomeli could not remember how they'd ended up choosing Scavizzi. There had been so much else for him to worry about, he'd not paid the decision much attention. He suspected the original proposal might have come from Totino. This was before it was discovered that the prefect of the Congregation for Bishops, who was under investigation for his wretched apartment extension, was planning to switch his support to Tedesco. Now, as Lomeli watched the elderly cleric being helped towards the microphone by Archbishop Mandorf, his shriveled body listing to one side, his notes clutched fiercely in his arthritic hand, his narrow eyes bright with resolve, he had a sudden premonition of trouble. Scavizzi grabbed the microphone and pulled it towards him. Amplified thumps ricocheted off the Sistine's walls. He held his pages up very close to his eyes, and for a few seconds nothing happened. Then, gradually, from the rasp of his laboured breathing, words began to emerge.
Cardinal brothers, at this moment of great responsibility, let us listen with special attention to what the Lord says to us in his own words. When I heard the Dean of this order in his homily this morning use St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians as an argument for doubt, I felt I could not believe my ears. Doubt! Is this what we are short of in the modern world? Doubt!
There was a slight noise from the body of the chapel, a murmuring, a general intake of breath, a shifting of positions in seats. Lomeli could hear his own pulse in his eardrums.
I implore you, even at this late hour, to listen to what St. Paul actually said, that we need unity in our faith and in our knowledge of Christ, in order not to be children, tossed one way and another, carried along by every word of doctrine. This is a boat in a storm he's talking about, my brothers. This is the bark of St. Peter, our holy Catholic Church, which has never before in its history is at the mercy of all the tricks men play and their cleverness in practising deceit. The winds and the waves our ship is battering go by many different names. Atheism, nationalism, agnosticism, Marxism, liberalism, individualism, feminism, capitalism. But every one of these isms seeks to divert from our true course. Your task, cardinal electors, is to choose a new captain who will ignore the doubters among us and hold the rudder fast. Every day a new ism arises, but not all ideas are of equal value. Not every opinion can be given due weight. Once we succumb to the dictatorship of relativism, as it has been properly called, and attempt to survive by accommodating ourselves to every passing sect and fad of modernism, our ship is lost. We do not need a church that will move with the world. We need a church that will move the world. Let us pray to God that the Holy Spirit enters these deliberations and directs you to a pastor who will put an end to the drifting of recent times, a pastor who will guide us once again to knowledge of Christ, to his love, and to true joy. Amen.
Scavizzi let go of the microphone. An explosion of amplification rang around the chapel. He gave a wobbly bow to the altar, then took Mandorf's arm. Leaning heavily on the Archbishop, he limped slowly down the aisle, watched in complete silence by every pair of eyes in the chapel. The old man looked at no one, not even Tedesco, who was seated in the front row almost opposite Lamelli. Now Lamelli knew why the Patriarch of Venice had been in such good humour. He'd known what was coming. It was possible even that he'd written it. Scavizzi and Mandorf passed out of sight behind the screen. In the stunned hush it was easy to hear their footsteps on the marble floor of the vestibule, the Sistine's doors opening and closing, the key turning in the lock. Conclave, conclavis, with a key. Since the 13th century, this was how the Church had ensured its cardinals would come to a decision. They would not be released from the chapel, except for meals and to sleep, until they had chosen a pope. Finally, the cardinal electors were alone. Lamelli rose and walked to the microphone. He moved slowly, trying to think how best to contain the damage that had just been done. The personal nature of the attack had stung him, naturally, but that concerned him less than the wider threat it posed to his mission, which was above all to maintain the unity of the Church. He sensed the need to slow things down, to let the shock of what happened dissipate, to give the argument for tolerance a chance to percolate back to the surface of the cardinals' minds. He faced the conclave just as the great bell of St. Peter began tolling 5 o'clock. He glanced at the windows. The sky was dark. He waited until the reverberations of the last strike had died away.
Cardinal brothers, after that stimulating meditation,
he paused. There was some sympathetic laughter.
We can now proceed to the first ballot. However, according to the Apostolic Constitution, voting may be delayed if a member of the conclave has an objection. So, does anyone wish to postpone the voting until tomorrow? I appreciate it has been an exceptionally long day, and we may wish to reflect further on what we have just heard. There was a pause. Then Krasinski used his stick to push himself up to his feet. The eyes of the world are on the Sistine chimney. Cardinal brothers, it is my view it would look odd, to say the least, if we stopped for the night. I believe we should vote.
He lowered himself carefully back into his seat. Lamelli glanced at Bellini. His face remained impassive. Nobody else spoke.
Very well. We shall vote.
He returned to his place and collected his rule-book and ballot paper, then went back to the microphone.
Dear brothers, you will find in front of you one of these. Now, you can see what it is? It says, I elect as Supreme Pontiff, written in Latin in the top half. The bottom half is blank. That is where you should write the name of your chosen candidate. Please make sure no one can see your vote, and be sure to put down one name only, otherwise your ballot will be null and void. And please write legibly, and in a way that ensures your handwriting cannot be identified. Now, if you will all turn to Chapter 5, Paragraph 66 of the Apostolic Constitution, you will see the procedure that has to be followed.
When they'd opened their rule-books, he read the paragraph aloud, just to make sure they all understood.
Each cardinal elector, in order of precedence, having completed and folded his ballot, holds it up so that it can be seen, and carries it to the altar, at which the scrutineers stand, and upon which there is placed a receptacle. It is covered by a plate,
and it is for receiving the ballots. Having reached the altar, the cardinal-elector says aloud the words of the following oath. I call as my witness Christ the Lord, who will be my judge, that my vote is given to the one who before God I think should be elected. He then places the ballot on the plate, which then drops into the receptacle. Having done this, he bows to the altar and returns to his place. Is that clear to everyone? Very good. Scrutineers, would you take your positions, please? The 3 men who would count the ballots had been chosen by lot the previous week. They were the Archbishop of Vilnius, Cardinal Luxa, the Prefect for the Congregation of Clergy, Cardinal Mercurio, and the Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Newby. They rose from their places in different parts of the chapel and made their way to the altar. Lomeli went back to his chair and picked up the pen that had been provided by the college. He shielded the ballot paper with his arm, like a candidate in an examination who doesn't want his answer to be seen by his neighbour, and wrote in capital letters, B-E-L-L-I-N-I. He folded it, stood, held it aloft, and walked to the altar. He gave the oath, and then moved to the large ornate urn on the altar, bigger than a normal altar vessel, and covered by a plain silver chalice. Watched intently by the scrutineers, he put his ballot paper on the chalice, lifted it with both hands, and tipped his vote into the urn. Replacing the chalice, he bowed to the altar and resumed his seat. The 3 patriarchs of the Eastern churches were the next, followed by Bellini. He recited the oath with a sigh in his voice, and then returned to his place. He put his hand to his brow and appeared to sink into deep thought. Lomeli, too tense for prayer or meditation, once again observed the cardinals as they passed him. Tedesco seemed uncharacteristically nervous. He fumbled the tipping of his ballot into the urn, so that it fell briefly on the altar, and he had to retrieve it and then drop it in by hand. Lomeli wondered if he'd voted for himself. Certainly Tremblay might have done so. There was nothing in the rules to say one couldn't. The oath was simply to vote for the person one thought should be elected. The Canadian approached the altar with reverential, downcast eyes, then raised them to the last judgment, apparently transported, and made an exaggerated sign of a cross. Another man who had faith in his own abilities was Adeyemi. He swore the oath with his trademark boom. He'd made his name as Archbishop of Lagos when the Holy Father had first toured Africa. He'd organised a mass attended by a congregation of more than 4 million. The Pope had joked in his homily that Joshua Adeyemi was the only man in the church who could have conducted the service without need for amplification. And then there was Benitez, of whom Lomeli had lost track since the previous night. One could at least be certain that he would not be voting for himself. The choir dress that had been found for him was too long. His rochet hung almost to the ground, and he nearly tripped over it as he reached the altar. When he'd finished voting and turned to go back, he gave Lomeli a wry glance. Lomeli nodded and smiled encouragement in return. The Filipino had an attractive quality, he thought, not easy to define. An inner grace. Now that he was becoming better known, he might go far. The voting went on more than an hour. When it began, there had been a few whispered conversations, but by the time the scrutineers cast their own ballots and the last man to vote, Bill Rudgard, the junior cardinal deacon, had returned to his seat, the silence seemed to have become endless and absolute, like the infinity of space. God has entered the room. We are sequestered under lock and key at the point where time and eternity meet. The urn was lifted and displayed to the conclave. The scrutineer shook it several times to mix up the ballots, then offered it to Cardinal Newby, who, without unfolding the voting papers, extracted them one by one, counting them out loud, and then transferring them to a second urn standing on the altar. At the end, the Englishman announced in his thickly accented Italian, 118 votes have been cast. He and Cardinal Mercurio went into the room of tears, the sacristy to the left of the altar, where the 3 different sizes of papal vestments were hanging, and emerged almost at once, carrying between them a small table. They set this up in front of the altar. Cardinal Luxa covered it with a white cloth and placed the urn containing the votes in the centre. Newby and Mercurio returned to the sacristy and fetched 3 chairs. Newby unclipped the microphone from its stand and carried it over to a table. My brothers, we shall proceed to count the first ballot. And now, at last, emerging from its trance, the conclave stirred. In the folder in front of them, every elector had been issued with a list, arranged alphabetically, of the cardinals eligible to vote. Lomeli was glad to see it been reprinted overnight to include Benitez. He picked up his pen. Luxor extracted the first ballot paper from the urn, unfolded it, and made a note of a name. He passed it to Mercurio, who studied it in turn and also recorded it. Then Mercurio handed it to Newby, who used a silver needle to pierce the vote through the word elect and thread it on a length of red silk cord. He leaned into the microphone. He had an easy, confident voice of a public school and Oxford man. The first vote is cast for Cardinal Tedesco. Each time a vote was announced, Lomeli put a tick against the candidate's name. At first it was impossible to get a sense of who was ahead. 34 cardinals, more than a quarter of the conclave, received at least one vote. It was said afterwards to be a record. Men voted for themselves, or for a friend, or a fellow countryman. Quite early on, Lomeli heard his own name read out. He awarded himself a tick on the list. He was touched someone should have considered him worthy of this supreme honour. He wondered who it was. But when it happened several times more, he began to feel alarmed. In such a crowded field, anything more than half a dozen votes would be enough, at least in theory, to put one in contention. He kept his head down, concentrating on the tally. Even so, he was aware of cardinals occasionally staring at him across the aisle. The race was slow and close, the distribution of support bizarrely random, so that one of the front-runners might be 2 or 3 votes in a row, and then receive none of the succeeding 20. Still, after about 80 or so ballots had been read out, it was clear which cardinals had the potential strength to emerge as pope. And, as predicted, they were Tedesco, Bellini, Tremblay, and Ademe. When 100 votes had been counted, there was still nothing between them. But then, at the end, something strange happened. Bellini's vote stalled, and the final few names read out must have felt like hammer blows to him. Tedesco, Lomeli, Ademe, Tremblay, and last of all, amazingly, Benitez. As the scrutineers confirmed and checked the totals, whispered conversations broke out around the chapel. Lomeli ran his pen down the list, adding up the votes. He scribbled figures beside each name. Tedesco, 22, Ademe, 19, Bellini, 18, Tremblay, 16, Lomeli, 5, others, 38. The size of his own vote dismayed him. Assuming he'd drawn away support from Bellini, he might well have cost him first place, and with it the sense of inevitability that might have carried him to victory. Indeed, the more he studied the figures, the more disappointing for Bellini they looked. Hadn't Sabadin, his campaign manager, predicted at dinner that he was certain to be in the lead after the first ballot, with up to 25 votes, and that Tedesco would receive no more than 15? Yet Bellini had come in third, behind Ademe. No one had envisaged that, and even Tremblay was only 2 votes behind him. One thing was certain. No candidate was anywhere near the 79 votes it would take to win the election. He was only half listening as Newby read out the official results. They merely confirmed what he'd already worked out for himself. Instead, he was flicking through the Apostolic Constitution to paragraph 74. No modern conclave had lasted beyond 3 days, but that didn't mean it might not. Under the rules, they were obliged to keep on balloting until they found a candidate who could command a 2/3 majority, if necessary for as many as 30 ballots, extending over 12 days. Only at the end of that time would they be permitted to use a different system, whereby a simple majority would be sufficient to elect a new pope. 12 days! An appalling prospect. Newby'd finished giving the results. He held up the red silk cord on which the ballots were threaded. He knotted the 2 ends together and moved towards the dean. Lomeli rose from his place and took the microphone. From the altar steps he could see Tedesco studying the voting figures, Bellini staring into nothing, Ademe and Tremblay talking quietly to the men either side of him. "My brother cardinals, That concludes the first ballot. No candidate having achieved the necessary majority, we shall now adjourn for the evening and resume voting in the morning. Will you please remain in your places until the officials are allowed back into the chapel? And may I remind your eminences that you are forbidden to take any written record of the voting out of the Sistine. Your notes will be collected from you and burnt along with the ballot papers. There will be buses outside to take you back to the Casa Santa Marta, and I would ask you humbly not to discuss this afternoon's vote in the hearing of the drivers. Thank you for your patience. I now invite the junior cardinal deacon to ask for us to be released. Radgard stood and walked to the back of the chapel. They could hear him knocking on the doors and calling for them to be opened. It was like a prisoner summoning his guard. A few moments later he returned, accompanied by Archbishop Mandorf, Monsignor O'Malley, and the other masters of ceremony. The priests were carrying paper sacks and went up and down the rows of desks collecting the voting tallies. Some of the cardinals were reluctant to hand them over and had to be persuaded to put them in the sacks. Others hung on to them for the last few seconds, no doubt trying to memorize the figures. Or perhaps, O'Malley thought, they were simply savouring the only record there would ever be of the day they received a vote to be Pope. Most of the cardinals did not go downstairs to the buses immediately, but gathered in the vestibule to watch the ballot papers and notes being burnt. It was something, after all, even for a prince of the church, to be able to say that he had witnessed such a spectacle. Even now the process of checking the votes had still not quite ended. 3 cardinals, known as revisers, also chosen by ballot before the conclave, were required to recount the tallies. The rules were centuries old and indicated how little the fathers of the church had trusted one another. It would require a conspiracy of at least 6 men to rig this election. When the revising was done, O'Malley squatted on his haunches, opened the round stove, and stuffed it with the paper sacks and threaded ballot papers. He struck a match, lit a firelighter, and placed it carefully inside. There was a soft whoomph of combustion, and within seconds the material was ablaze. O'Malley closed the iron door. The second stove, the square one, contained a mixture of potassium perchlorate, together with anthracene and sulphur, in a cartridge that ignited when a switch was pressed. At 7:42 p.m., the temporary metal chimney jutting above the roof of the Sistine, picked out in the November darkness by a searchlight, began to gush jet-black smoke. As the members of the conclave filed out of the chapel, O'Malley drew O'Malley aside. They stood in a corner of the vestibule.
"Did you speak to Morales? Only on the telephone, Your Eminence. And?"
O'Malley put his finger to his lips and glanced over O'Malley's shoulder. Tremblay was passing, sharing a joke with a group of cardinals from the US. His bland face was cheerful. After the North Americans had strolled out, O'Malley said, "Monsignor Morales was emphatic that he knows no reason why Cardinal Tremblay should not be Pope." O'Malley had not expected much else.
"Thank you at least for asking him."
A sly look came into O'Malley's eyes.
"However, will you forgive me, Your Eminence, if I say that I did not entirely believe the good Monsignor?"
O'Malley stared at him. When there wasn't a conclave, the Irishman was secretary of a congregation for bishops. He had access to the files on 5,000 senior clerics. He was said to have a nose for discovering secrets.
"Why do you say that?"
"Because when I tried to press him regarding the meeting between the Holy Father and Cardinal Tremblay, he went out of his way to assure me it was entirely routine. My Spanish is not perfect, but I have to say he was so emphatic, he rather aroused my suspicions. So I implied, I did not specifically state as a fact, I hope. Let us say I hinted in my inadequate Spanish that you might have seen a document that contradicted that. And he said you were not to worry about the document. El informe ha sido retirada."
"El informe? A report? There was a report?"
"The report has been withdrawn," were the exact words.
"On what? Withdrawn when?"
"I do not know, Eminence." It had been a long day. Lamelli was hungry. Was he to be worried that a report had been compiled, or reassured that it might no longer exist? Did it matter much, given that Tremblay was in fourth place? Suddenly he threw up his hands. He could not deal with it now. Not while he was sequestered in the conclave. It's probably nothing. Let us leave it there. I know I can rely on your discretion. The two prelates walked across the Sala Regia. A security man watched them from beneath a fresco of the Battle of Lepanto. He turned his body away slightly and whispered something into either his sleeve or lapel. Lamelli wondered what it was they were always talking about in such urgent tones. Is something happening in the outside world I should know? Not really. The main story in the international media is the conclave. No leaks, I trust. No, none. The reporters interview one another. They began to descend the stairs. A great many steps, 30 or 40, lit on either side by electric lamps shaped like candles. Some of the older cardinals found their steepness a challenge. I should add there is great interest in Cardinal Benitez. We have put out a biographical note as you requested, and I've also included a background note for you in confidence. He really has enjoyed the most remarkable series of promotions of any bishop in the church. O'Malley pulled an envelope from beneath his vestments and handed it to Lamelli. La Repubblica believes his dramatic arrival is all part of the late Holy Father's secret plan. I would be delighted if there was a plan, secret or otherwise. But I sense that the only one with a plan for this conclave is God, and so far he seems to be determined to keep it to himself.